perfect foresight. So if we had uncertainty, if people didn't know, they had a probability distribution about the future, then the whole thing would become more complicated because savings behavior would change. We'd also have to ask about what type of assets do people have. Do they have assets with state contingent payments, for example? And so on and so forth. And finally, the thing that I brought up, if capital market imperfections prevent consumption smoothing. Now, that's something I brought up on Wednesday afternoon. I said, suppose that there's a risk that further down the road, someone in that country that's sitting on these negative or on these liabilities, right? So let me go back to the picture, right? Suppose that in period 15, when this shock is long gone, and suppose this is not about months, this is about generations, right? So every period is 25 years. Suppose that 15 times 25 years later, which is a long time, someone says, where do these liabilities come from? And someone says, yeah, what is 15 times 25? I should know. It's probably, 375 years. Okay, use your smartphone. Anyway, so suppose that more than 100 years later, someone says, where do these liabilities come from? And someone says, more than 100 years ago, our economy had this shock, and that's why we had these, we borrowed abroad, and we're sitting on these liabilities. And then someone says, look, I don't care. Let's just renege on making the payments, because we make these interest payments all the time. I don't want to do that. I have nothing to do with these people doing this in the past. Now, that would mean a default. Now, the problem is, if there's a risk of default further down the road, financial markets will be very, very reluctant to lend in the first place, right? Because if there is a risk of default in period 15, financial markets will say, okay, we'll liquidate our assets in period 14. If that happens, and so by backward induction, you'll get to the present and say, if the country turns to the financial market and says, look, we are in a tight spot, can you please lend us money because we want a smooth consumption? International financial markets would say, no, we don't. And then you ask, why don't you do that? And international financial markets say, because you will default. And you say, no, I'll never default, right? I'll certainly not do that. And financial markets will say, who knows, right? And if this, then you have all of a sudden you have sand in the wheels of international financial markets, right? And things do not operate as smoothly as suggested in this model. Now, financial markets are full of imperfections. You have default risk, you have asymmetric information, you have all kinds of behavioral biases. But if we started with these imperfections, it would be like talking about a car and talking about the fact that by driving a car you can have an accident, right? Which doesn't make sense. I mean, driving a car you can get from A to B. That's the thing. And of course, having talked about that, we have to talk about, yeah, maybe there's a risk of having an accident. This is why you need a driver's license. Regulation, right? That's the right approach. Again, international financial markets are a cool thing. They sometimes do not do what we would like them to do. That's why we need proper policy to turn them into a benefit. Okay. Good. Okay, so that was my introductory sermon, and as I said, I'll come back to yesterday's conference over and over again. It was actually a very, very nice experience, and of course it's nice to go to Ho Chi Minh City and to put on a tie and to have all these smart people and so. But by the end of the day, I mean, the substance of what was done yesterday is the stuff that we're doing here, not wearing a tie and not being dressed up and not getting little cookies during the break. Okay, so let's introduce endogenous output. So far, output was exogenous. So exogenous output, the best way to describe it is you have several coconut trees, and the coconut trees generate coconuts, and that's your output. And you cannot affect the number of coconuts, and you cannot affect the number of coconut trees. So now we assume that output is produced using labor, L, and capital. And we have a production function, which probably you've seen already, right? Which is output at time S as a function of the capital stock in period S and employment in period S, and a parameter that we call total factor productivity. Now the consequences are that variations in total factor productivity and labor supply are potential source of output fluctuations. And secondly, and even more importantly, the evolution of the physical capital stock is driven by investment. So you can determine how much capital you have in the next period. And when I talk about capital, I'm not talking about money in the bank. I'm talking about physical capital, roads, infrastructure, these things. And as we'll see, we have the physical capital stock as an alternative asset. And that'll eventually help us to explain one important condition that we'll now derive. Now, before we go on, let me again be almost philosophical. Well, in a closed economy, you have you don't have net exports, right? Net exports are zero. And I should say in a financially closed economy. So that should be a lowercase. Good. This in turn implies that yt minus ct equals it. And in the closed economy, this is savings. So in a closed economy, savings equals investment, by definition. Now, this looks like some nerdy national accounting fact, but in fact, this is super relevant. So, ST equals IT means that if you want to increase the capital stock in the domestic economy, you want to do a lot of investment, you have to save a lot. What is saving? Saving is output minus consumption. Now, saving a lot means you devote a large part of output not to consumption, but to you save it and you put it into investment. Now, consumption is what makes us happy. People might say, no, there's other values in life, and I completely agree. But by the end of the day, if someone reduces your consumption by 50% and says, look, you're used to having 3 meals a day, but now it's just going to be 1, then people will get unhappy. Now, what I want to say is here, if you are a financially closed economy, you either save a lot and invest a lot. Now, saving might be very painful, especially when your income level is very low to start with. Or you save very little and then you invest very little. You stay poor, right? You don't have the means to invest because you basically, suppose you're a low income country, you have no way to save, right? If you live on a banana a day, saving that banana will make you starve. And so the problem is, if this constraint is binding, you will never make the big investment that you need to get out of poverty. Now, conversely, if someone decides that he wants your country or she wants your country to get out of poverty by doing big investments, that person has somehow has to convince you to save. And convince you might actually mean force you. Now, that might be very painful. Now, what I'm talking about as one episode in history is the industrialization of the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. That was a poster case for someone deciding that investment has to go up, consumption has to go down, we can't help it, and a whole generation of people in Russia and other countries were actually forced to reduce consumption substantially. And of course, what they were promised was, look, once we've gone through that, we'll have a situation where we are, in a better stage. And you could argue that, in a way, it worked, right? In a couple of decades,